Hour. Widesite TV.
Let's talk about COP26 first. I know GWEC's very much involved in that. Tell me what your plans are first.
So COP26 is happening in Glasgow in about 4 weeks' time, as you know. It's probably arguably the most important COP negotiation of any of the COPs till now. And it's really a kind of crucial kind of moment in the kind of fight to stop climate change. So nations are coming together in Glasgow. GWEC will be there representing the wind industry. We have formed the Wind Energy Coalition COP26, which brings together the leading corporates in the wind energy industry and also the associations from around the world. And we're really going to have a kind of strong presence there to show policymakers how wind energy is probably the most important piece in the transition to a new power system.
Why do you say it's the most important COP?
It's the most important COP because the commitments that were made at Paris were for countries to come back and with concrete commitments on a national level called Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs, and present action plans around those targets, and for those targets to be compatible with a scenario that limits global heating to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So really it's where countries now have to come back with targets that are compliant with Paris and say this is what we're actually going to do. So if they can come to an agreement around that then sets the stage for taking decisive action in the next 2 decades to head off dangerous climate change. If they can't come to an agreement, then we're in trouble.
So then in a nutshell, what does COP26 need to achieve?
So COP26 needs to get all the nations on the same page around their nationally determined contributions and their action plans so that we can move decisively to cutting emissions in a way that's compatible with net zero targets and decisively stopping climate change. If we can't come to an agreement, then things very much still up in the air. So the real hope is that there'll be an agreement around NDCs. There's a couple of other very important elements. One is global coal phase out, and that's something that the UK has been pushing very hard for. I mean, the international organisations now say that coal needs to be phased out over the next kind of 4 or 5 years. So we really need to do this now. And then the third thing is climate finance. So there's a kind of pre-existing commitment to the developed nations providing something like $100 billion in finance to the developing world to help those countries cut their emissions, and hopefully there'll be an agreement around that as well.
How confident are you feeling at this point?
It's hard to say. I mean, we're very positive. One of the reasons we're positive is because the UK is running the COP Secretariat and kind of driving the process through the COP President, Alok Sharma and his team. And the UK has a very important success story to tell to the world. Firstly, on coal phase out, precisely. I mean, the UK has actually, I think, been more successful than even itself thought it could be in terms of getting coal off the system over the last kind of 5 years and a decade. And the second thing is a very successful story around offshore wind, which is why we're here today at this conference. So having a COP presidency that's kind of driving the process in a proactive way is obviously really helpful. But you never know. I mean, there's many interests in play. There's many large nations that are in a negotiation, including China, India, the US, the European Union, and sometimes these meetings can go right to the wire without any kind of idea of if there's going to be a successful resolution or not. So, but I'm feeling fairly confident that we'll see progress on at least 2 out of the 3 main planks.
Complete swerve to a totally different topic. You were speaking earlier on a panel about the Japanese offshore wind markets. How are you seeing that market develop?
So there's been real progress. I mean, as you know, Japan has been talking about offshore wind, for quite a while, and that conversation kind of intensified after the Fukushima nuclear accident back then in 2011, and the nuclear phase out. But things are now really finally starting to advance. We've been involved with our partners in the Japanese Wind Power Association in a kind of joint task force to try and help the Japanese government develop a framework for offshore wind. Those conversations have been very successful and resulted at the beginning of this year in the Japanese offshore wind vision document. And that contains up to 45 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040. So it's one of the most ambitious targets in the world now, actually. So we're very, very pleased with that work. And then on the ground, there's all kinds of parts of legislation and regulation that are being put into place. There's several auction rounds underway. There's even been a floating auction. So things are really starting to move. I mean, there's lots to be done, and they have quite ambitious targets, and they're going to have to create a whole industry to scale up and meet those targets. But it can be done, and Japan has formidable kind of industrial base and skills and know-how and finance to be able to put into this thing. So it's actually very exciting.
So there's a lot of momentum, as you say, but what are the limiting factors? Are there any limiting factors?
I think creating a supply chain, almost from scratch, where they do have very strong industrial companies. I think stakeholder management in Japan is complex, and traditionally things have gone very, very slowly. And that was the experience for onshore wind, for instance. And there's powerful stakeholder groups, including fisheries, that the industry needs to kind of interact with and negotiate with, and the government needs to play a very important role there. And then there's also, there's a lot of complexity. I mean, things tend to get very complex in Japan, and the systems can be complicated and onerous. And really, I mean, they have a 10 gigawatt target 2030. It's kind of 2030 for the offshore wind industry is kind of today in terms of what you need to do. So things need to get moving quite fast. But again, we are confident because they do have formidable kind of skills and capacities in Japan.
And what other new markets are you excited about?
So there's a whole number of countries that are now kind of moving more decisively to develop their markets. I mean, first of all, I have to mention China, because we always talk about Europe and European offshore, but actually China is moving extremely fast. And this year is actually the expiry of at the end of this year is the expiry of the feed-in tariff for offshore wind in China. So there's a big industry kind of push to complete projects ahead of that. We think that the China will do 7.5 gigawatts this year, and that will put China in first place, actually ahead of the UK for the first time, and make China actually quite significantly the biggest offshore market just in itself. And then you have the big Asian governments. So Japan we already talked about. Korea is moving much faster now and more decisively, and we expect to see a kind of blossoming sector in Korea. We're still excited about Vietnam. I mean, there's been quite a lot of kind of ups and downs and issues, and it's been difficult during COVID, but there's a clear need and not many alternatives to offshore wind in the midterm for Vietnam. And then there's some more kind of lesser known markets. The Philippines is starting to move, and then Australia is starting to move, even though there's no particular central government support. There's projects. I mean, there's projects and things are starting to move, and the regulators are kind of engaging. So there's quite a few places that are exciting, and we've also been working, for instance, with Costa Rica. We're working with Colombia. Brazil is starting to be, quite exciting, and will come out with their ministerial decree on offshore by the end of this year. So there's many markets and governments engaging on offshore, because it's the only really clear kind of technology for many countries that can develop zero carbon power in a kind of large scale, competitively, quite relatively quickly.
And you've been involved in the World Bank Key Factors report that's just been released. What can you tell me about that?
So yes, I did. I did actually write the foreword to this report, which was launched today, and we've been working quite closely with the World Bank Group for the last three years, I think, to take this kind of taking offshore wind global program to emerging markets governments. And in 2019, we brought 13 governments to the UK and took them on a study tour to the northeast of the UK. We were actually at this event 3 years ago with the delegations and interacting with the industry and stakeholders. We had a virtual study tour last year that I think had 24 governments involved. And really the program is to kind of address this kind of appetite for developing offshore wind markets for emerging markets. So the report sets out, as it says, key factors for success around program, around regulatory frameworks, around the development of supply chain, around stakeholder movements. So it's a kind of guide to the kind of elements that need to be in place to develop a successful offshore wind sector.
Okay, let's come back to Europe now. Most of Europe is currently suffering from a gas shortage, which is having an impact on supply chains and industrial output and people's lives, really. Do you think there's a possibility it could affect public appetite for variable generation sources?
It's noticeable that some of the commentary and the commentators that were more negative around wind power and variable renewables several years ago are now kind of back in the public eye again and are kind of coming out with critical positions around variable renewables. And we've seen it in newspapers. There was an editorial in this week's Economist, kind of saying we need more, nuclear power. We've got too much reliance on, variable renewables, and it's interesting actually, from a logical point of view to look at it how this has happened, because we've been saying as an industry for many years that relying on volatile, fossil fuels, which are basically a tradable commodity that's traditionally shown very high levels of volatility. And I used to work as an energy market analyst back in the day. It's an extremely volatile commodity, oil and gas. And one of our arguments historically for renewables has been that we can provide more long-term certainty than fossil fuels can, and we can provide countries with their own indigenous energy sources so that we don't depend on foreign governments, for instance, like Russia, which seemingly is still able to squeeze European countries with the gas supply. So I'm kind of interested in this kind of climate that's being formed at the moment, but the real answer for me is that we should be doing a lot more renewables and we should be moving more decisively, because we're still dependent on these kind of very volatile fossil fuel sources. And frankly, when I look outside in the street and I see people queuing up for petrol, gasoline, and energy prices quadrupling, it reminds me of the kind of 1970s when we had the energy crisis. And actually, we knew what the answer was then, which was wind and solar. And now we should be a lot further along that curve. So, what this means is we need to invest more in systems. We need to follow through with the energy transition. We need to have fully decarbonised systems. We need to have everything in place so that you can have a sustainable, kind of viable system using different sources of energy and storage, which allow us to move away from fossil. It would be really tragic if we went back to this debate around, kind of needing, base load or nuclear and all these things that we know won't help us to solve the climate crisis.
It's a really strong argument, thank you. Reshmi, let's come to you. First of all, tell me what was your background and how are you involved in GWEC and how did you come to be here right now?
So I initially joined GWEC through an internship opportunity which was presented to me through my university, which is the University of Sussex. And so I initially started doing a research project for them, and a few months in I was asked kindly by the team to stay on and help assist on the COP26 activities, which will be happening in about a month's time. So I'm busy with all things related to COP at the moment.
And you're working on a paper about the just transition at the moment.
Yeah.
What are some of the key themes you're addressing in that paper?
So I think the topic of just transitions is very much at the forefront of social conversation around the globe. It's definitely at the forefront of a lot of conversations. And So my project is looking specifically at the workforce development of workers in carbon-intensive industries. That includes oil and gas, coal, the automotive sector, and how these workers are being guided into the green economy, and in particular into the wind industry. So I've been looking at the skills gap that exists in a lot of countries, especially when looking at coal to wind. There's a huge skill gap there which needs to be addressed, and just the factors that need to be increased, like in terms of driving the just transition. So for example, increased investment is needed, increased social dialogue is needed. Not a lot of workers know what their options are, know about opportunities in the green economy, and lastly also addressing major reskilling issues in the UK. A lot of people want to reskill but they can't afford to, and that's a problem that is across the board. So I think an increased importance on education and reskilling is what will drive the just transition, really. And I think human capital is at the centre of the problem. Addressing these socio-economic issues is highly important.
Energy. Energy. Marine. Energy. Power. Widesite TV.